everybody.
Good evening. How's everybody doing? Hello. Thank you. All right. Welcome. My name is Raul Gomez Rojas. Welcome to this pre-concert conversation brought to you by Old Classical Portland and your Oregon Symphony. I think you all know who is sitting to my right, so please welcome Maestro Danzmayr.
Hello, everybody.
It was just a gorgeous autumn afternoon here in Portland. And I got to see you this morning because you visited young musicians from the Metropolitan Youth Symphony and you worked with them. So you're already out in the community, and really getting the full Portland experience. Did you also get to spend a little time outside and enjoy the weather, a little windy, but...
Yeah, I did. I took a long walk, got some shopping done and everything, but like with that kind of weather, of course, need to use. I will say though, all the days, even when it rained a little bit, I thought the weather was fantastic. I really, this little rain, this like what I call Irish rain, in Ireland is weather similar. It's always drizzling, but it's never drizzling enough that you can't go outside. So as long as I can go outside and enjoy a walk and so, the weather is good.
Yeah, it's been a nice week outside. And it's also been a really nice week in here, in this hall. I have had the fortune to sit here and listen to all of the rehearsals leading up to these performances. And I think we should just dive in and talk about the music. So the concert is entitled Austrian Music Through the Ages. So let's talk first about the one composer in the program who's not Austrian.
Well, it's hard to choose which one. There is secret, but I will only little spoiler here that there is actually 2 German composers on the program. You will not believe me, but it's true. And I will say at the beginning of the concert, so I don't want to spoil you. But the one composer that is very, very clearly not Austrian is Bach, a German composer from Leipzig, the most famous Baroque composer. And we actually, what we are doing this season is we have from every orchestra section a soloist. So in the Bach double concerto, we have Principal Oboe, Marty, and our concertmaster, Sarah. And then later in the season, we will have Chatik on the tuba as a soloist, and then we will have a piece with a percussion player from the orchestra as well. So we wanted to make sure to feature, musicians from the orchestra, because when I took over, I realized that the orchestra, there is so much talent in there, so many fantastic players on the level of soloists, so we want to showcase that more.
Yeah, and of course Sarah Kwak is the concertmaster of the orchestra. She has a leadership role, very important role. Marty is the principal oboe. He and Sarah both get to play solos as part of the repertoire that the orchestra plays often, but it's great to see them standing here in front of the orchestra. And I was talking to them about this, and they said that they really feel supported by their peers, by the orchestra.
I think the orchestra is generally a very supportive and very good-natured orchestra. I will say, you can tell as a conductor the spirit of an orchestra fairly quickly. And I remember when I was here 4 years ago, was maybe the first time or so, that immediately I had the feeling, it's a very good atmosphere to work in. And I'm not surprised that they feel that also from their colleagues, there is this real, they want them to do good and they want to play with them. There's a real joy of making music together, I think, among colleagues here.
Let's talk about the next piece in the program, and Austrian composer Haydn. And today is actually a really, really special date because to this date, October 30th, 125 years ago, was the very first Oregon Symphony performance ever. And I understand that, yes, it's something to clap for. 125 years, and I understand that Haydn's Symphony Opus 94, Surprise Symphony, was in that program, and it's been played tonight.
Yes, I want to point out that, of course, with 125-year anniversary, that makes it one of the oldest orchestras in the US. And actually also worldwide, it's like, I remember when I was music director in Zagreb, we had celebrated our 150th, but Zagreb, one of the very old orchestras in Europe. Even then, of course, the Vienna Philharmonic and so date even further back. But that is a long history to have in an orchestra. That is really one of the really cultural institutions that really date back a very long time. This is a very fantastic anniversary, I think. Haydn Surprise Symphony was on the program, on the very first program of the Oregon Symphony, and so we thought like, well, you waited 125 years to listen to it again, so we should play. But yeah, it's a great piece of music. Haydn, Austrian composer, originally Viennese composer, but in some ways an Austrian countryside composer because he lived in Esterházy Castle most of the year. The Count of Esterházy, who had many composers at his court in times. Schubert was living there for a while, and so, but Haydn was his court composer. And so Haydn wrote most of his symphonies and most of his works for Esterházy. He was basically in the salary of Esterházy. So Esterházy would provide salary for Haydn and for the musicians that Haydn used, and they were the Count's orchestra and the Count's composer.
And then his employment with the Esterházy came to an end, and then he left and went to London.
Yes, so it was interesting when you think that, you know, Haydn was this very stable composer, and also the way that he had to write for Esterházy, right? Esterházy was like, you know, in 2 weeks, friends are coming, new symphony, yeah? And that was the reality of that time. It was not like wait a year to write a symphony, next 2 weeks, you know, symphony. But interestingly, Haydn, he was quite old for that time, you know. I mean, like he was one of the people of the composers, not like Mozart or Schubert, who died very early, but who really lived a long and healthy life. He went to London and he wrote his last 12 symphonies then in London. So that's the very special part of his life, you know, the freedom that he had in London. Huge success, big star in London.
And, you know, I think that often when we think of Haydn, you know, we think of the classical period, we think of pre-Mozart, we think of, you know, pretty refined music and almost, you know, some people might find it even a little boring, right? But you are finding things in this piece, and again, because I've been here in rehearsals, you're finding excitement and drama. And so what is under the surface, and what do you try to find in this music and your work?
I think every music is has some sense of drama or story. I think born like that. I always thought this is the most normal thing for everybody, that when I as a kid heard music, it was always like a story, always some connection to a story in my head, to some pictures, to some ideas. I never listened to music absolute. So I think that sense of drama or that sense of story, that sense of you know, finding these things in the music just came to me from a very young age. I think there with the great composers like Haydn, Beethoven, and so there really should not be boredom. It's really on us. Now I put, of course, now pressure on me, because now if you in the audience tell me afterwards, well, we were bored after all, you know, I'm saying it's my fault, which it is. So I really think that this kind of music, you know, should be exciting and should be sprightly. And I think particularly Haydn, he was such a humorous and such a character, you know. He did things that were outrageous to the Count. You know, there was a time he had the feeling he and the musicians were kept too long, and then he wrote a symphony where the musicians would walk out one by one and blow out their candles in a kind of like protest action at that time against the Count keeping them too long. And so he was a very outspoken, very funny, very intelligent person, so I don't think that his music was meant to be boring.
Yes. Well, and he carried that over to London, of course, when he worked on those 12 symphonies, but he did include in this symphony, Opus 94, well, a surprise.
Well, the idea was that, of course, at that time, doesn't matter if the music was exciting or boring, some of the aristocrats, it was more a political thing, you know, they would get invited, or, you know, the people who came to these concerts in London, you know, it was the thing to do. So some of these people who came to the concerts really didn't come to listen to the music, it was more to, you know, it was just the event of the evening and you would go there. And so they would fall asleep, you know. And so Haydn, in the second movement, that is the slow movement, where most of the people, you know, that would not be into the music fall asleep. What he does very effectively is he kind of like makes this huge hit of loud music at the beginning, and he said that very specifically in order to wake the people up who dozed off already. So I hope that doesn't, I mean, I'm sorry I'm spoiling the surprise, but I would hope that, you know, none of you fall asleep in the second movement already of the Haydn Symphony. That would not be good.
And there is that moment, but also the music is so rich with contrast and, you know, with just excitement. You know, there's my favorite moment, perhaps, is a very personal thing, is not the big surprise, but in the fourth movement, there's a moment where all of a sudden the timpani player just plays essentially as loud as they can play.
Yeah, we worked on that in the rehearsal to bring out, because, you know, our timpani player, John, he's a fantastic musician, you know, such a cultured and wonderful person. And the first 2 times round in the rehearsal, you know, I felt he tried to play this sudden timpani hit very close to the end of the movement, very cultured and very, you know, he really tried not to ruin the sound. And I was just like, go crazy. And so I think, you know, yesterday already he proved that he can go really completely bonkers on that passage. But yeah, obviously very typical for Haydn that this one big surprise that he spoke about, that he wrote, was not enough for him. You know, this symphony is full of these moments of where you think it goes a certain way, and then it just like turns a corner into a completely different direction, like with this timpani hit. It really sounds like the movement is gonna go out peacefully, and, you know, he has done none of it.
Now, so Austria, Haydn. Let's go in chronological order, even though it's not necessarily program order. Next in the program after intermission is Frankenstein by H.K. Gruber. But maybe before we talk about that, let's talk about the last piece in the program, which is, of course, the Emperor Waltzes by Johann Strauss Jr. So why is this an important composer, and why is this a special piece of music?
Well, I mean, you will hear this again, but I will give you the insight before you know, I'm telling to all the audience that the unfortunate situation for us Austrians with the Emperor Waltz is that it was written by a German composer. Because Strauss, he was married one time to, you know, a woman he very loved, and unfortunately she was not very healthy and she passed away, and then he married a second time, and it was kind of the opposite situation. His second wife was extremely healthy, but she was, you know, not the best wife for him, and there were massive problems, you know, with her cheating with a theater director of all people, and so on. So Strauss wanted to get a divorce. In Austria at that time, that was not possible. Divorces were not allowed because we are a Catholic country to this day. Now, of course, you know, it's 21st century. It's very, very easily possible to get divorced, but at his time, it was not allowed. So the only thing that he could ask for, which he did, was annulment of the marriage, and they didn't grant in Vienna. It was not granted. And a German count of Gotha, one of the German kingdoms, heard about that, and he said to Strauss, it's actually a fantastic idea. He said, well, if you become a citizen of Gotha, of Germany, you can get a divorce. I will make sure we will grant you a divorce. And Strauss didn't hesitate very long. He just you know, sent his Austrian citizenship back and went to Germany and became a German. That's of course something we don't talk about, but for me the most funny thing about that story is that the Emperor Waltz was written in honor of the Austrian Emperor, although it was as a kind of meant as a present to a meeting between the Austrian and the German Emperor. But, you know, I don't think they talked a lot about that Strauss was a German composer who wrote kind of like a waltz for, you know, in honor of the Austrian Emperor at this time. Yeah.
And of course, he wrote many waltzes, the king of waltzes and marches. And this piece begins with a slow march, right? And I want to ask you about the very specific stylistic idiosyncrasies of this music. For example, the very opening theme of the march, if you play that as printed, da, 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 that's not how you do it. So how do you find this? How do you explain this to orchestras and the waltz and pa, 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 that sort of Viennese feel?
I think the most important thing to understand in that context, and I really mean it, is that Austrians tend to be somewhat sloppy. You know, we are not like the Swiss or like the Germans, and it's very important for me to explain that, right? Because we speak the same language, German, a little bit different dialect and like the Swiss, you know, we share the language, but we don't share the culture. The only part of Germany that we share culture with is Bavaria, the south of Germany, which was an own kingdom, and the Bavarian princess Sissi was married to the Austrian emperor, and there is one culture, and also the north of Italy. You know, the cultural boundaries are very, very interesting in Europe, which is extremely historic. I'm a history geek, but the cultural boundaries have very little to do with the boundaries of the countries. Like there is often cultural zones that cross the boundaries, right? And so often people have this, I think, idea of the Austrians being like the Germans, which is very, very far from the truth. You know, we're always huge melting pot of all cultures. Vienna, particularly, when you look nowadays still in the Viennese phone book, at least 50% of the names you find there have no Germanic roots. It's all, you know, Eastern European. And so my manager always says Austria is the first Eastern European country, and I can see that. You know, it makes a lot of sense culturally. And so in terms of the playing, you know, when you talk about how the music is notated, but how it's supposed to play, right? This is a very typical Austrian thing, that we would write it down some way, but that's not really the main way we mean it, you know? Like the rhythm is written pa-pa, pa-pum, pum, pum, but we do a pa-pum, pa-pim, pa-pum, pum, pum. You know, it's kind of like just the way we are, I think, you know? It's never quite, you never quite get exactly what you expect.
And when you hear an orchestra or a conductor do it, let's say, not right, you know, or rather, when they're doing it so right that it's not right, yes. What is your reaction? Like, what do you?
I've become a fairly polite person. I think I would just like not say anything. I mean, the thing for me is this is a thing you have in your blood and in your. I mean, I have, of course, an advantage with this kind of music, right? Because when I was even teenager, 15, 16, I played in salon orchestras, and I was thrilled because I would, you know, play these waltzes on the piano, and I would get money for it. So, you know, that was fantastic. The only thing I always had to be so careful was the repeats. There are always repetitions, and you decide before yes or no. And I was always that person who didn't get it. You know, I would always ask my colleagues, oh man, like, was there a repeat here? And they would be like, whatever, yes, no. I would try to write it in, forget it again. So that was always the stress for me. But the feeling, I grew into the feeling of how to play this, how this music goes as a kid. You know, that's a natural way to learn it. You just play along and you ask some question, and they're like, stop asking questions, just do it. Yeah, and then you learn how to observe it and how to absorb it. And then later I even opened dancing, you know, balls in formation, you know, with choreography. So I danced a lot of waltz. You know, you get a feeling when you dance about how the tempo should be, and then of course you take freedoms when you do it for concert, because, you know, you don't want the same rigidity. But even there as a dancer, it's hilarious, you know, when the orchestra suddenly makes an accelerando, speeds up, and, you know, you stumble across your fields, everybody's laughing, you know, it's not something that you hold against them, where you kind of like in Austria, like, oh, the orchestra shouldn't have done that. It's kind of part of like the laughing when people bump into each other because the tempo got too fast. No?
Because it's a party.
It is.
It's not like a choreographed ballet.
No, we have a real tradition of the balls. Like when I was a teenager, like later teenager, like 16, 17, 18, I would go to a lot of these balls, and we would look forward for weeks. Yeah. You know, every school had their own ball, and we would get into our suits, you know, dress up really properly.
You would learn how to dance.
And then, you know, kind of like, you know, learn how to dance. Some people learn it in school, some people learn it like from their friends or so. So there is a real culture of that. It is a huge way of socializing.
What you're saying right now, I experienced it in Costa Rica with salsa.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. It's the same idea. Yeah.
You know, we in high school we would teach each other how to dance salsa, because you have these parties, and, you know, the 15 años parties. Like, you better know how to dance.
Absolutely,
right?
Absolutely. It is really also a way to get to know each other, right? You know, it's you also expected to ask each other out. So if you know, as in my age, you know, nowadays I think it's more equal. You know, the ladies can also ask the men out. In my time, it was more that, you know, you were supposed as a kind of like, you know, 16, 17-year-old guy to, you know, somehow formally go to, you know, a woman and like, you know, bow a little bit and, you know, ask for the dance. So it was great. I enjoyed that very much, very, very much. Beautiful.
Okay, that's wonderful. We could talk about this for 2 hours, but we really should talk about the other piece in the program, because you are joined on stage by a living legend, H.K. Gruber, who wrote Frankenstein, a pandemonium for baritone chansonnier and orchestra. Tell us a little bit about this piece, and I also want to hear from you, you know, what it's been like to work right next to this just incredible person, you know, a legend and one of the most important composers in the world.
Yeah, it's a huge honor. It's very funny because when you see, you know, Gnarly Gruber on stage, we all call him Gnarly. His name is HK, but he has the nickname Gnarly. So then you will have this feeling of this completely relaxed, somewhat quirky, you know, person. He has absolutely no pretentious or so, but it is very true that Gnarly is, I mean, at least among the top 10, most probably top 5 of you know, famous and most played composers of the last 50 years for orchestra music. His piece Frankenstein that we will play tonight was played over 1,000 times since it was written. And I personally don't know any other piece that was written in the last 50 years for orchestra that was played that much. I'm sure there are 3, 4 more, but it is one of the most successful pieces of orchestra music written in the last 50 years. And a lot of the times he has done the role of the chansonnier himself, and he described that as a way, the way he formed like a new school in Vienna together with his friend Kurt Schwerzig. And what they wanted to do is a little bit following in the style of Kurt Weill, and so basically writing music that is really complex and challenging for the orchestra, but that people in the audience can come to and can enjoy and listen to without any knowledge, you know, without any prior knowledge. It should music that you can sit down and enjoy, so not hardcore avant-garde, basically.
Yeah. Yes, and the piece, Gruber used poems or rhymes by Hans Karl Artmann, Austrian poet, one of the biggest figures in Austrian literature. He passed away in 2000. And these are, you have inserts in your programs, by the way, and I strongly recommend that you read those poems before the performance. They are funny and just delightfully like creepy and sort of spooky, and you know, there are pop culture characters, Superman, Batman and Robin, and John Wayne. And what he does with the music, I think you will agree that it just, you know, matches perfectly the tone of the poems.
Yes, the interesting thing about Artmann, and that was very typical with him, is he wrote these poems that on the surface look like children poems, and they are. You know, you can just read them to children and they giggle along, and it's very fun and all is good. They are very political as well in many ways, and you know, very for his time very provocative. You know, the one poem, for example, about Batman and Robin lying together in bed. I mean, that was written at a time when these kind of things were really not that accepted in Austria, right? I mean, when we think, you know, when it was written. So there is political messages in there, all kinds of hidden messages, which is very funny, you know, to discover. But at the same time, they also work fantastically as kind of like Halloween spooky children's poems about Frankenstein and so. And I think it's incredible what Gruber does with the music. I mean, my favorite part is very close to the end. It's where a kid goes to Dr. Frankenstein with the doll and basically asks Dr. Frankenstein if he managed to fix the doll. So apparently the kid brought the doll to a shop for fixing dolls. And so Frankenstein talks about how wonderful, you know, he put the heart of a criminal into the doll, and, you know, all of these kind of horrible things, and the kid just goes delighted how wonderful this doll is. You know, you can hear the heartbeat and the lungs and all, and it's just like so, I think, hilariously creepy in the way that also the communication works, how Gruber like has this very dark voice for Frankenstein, and then he acts really like this incredibly overly delighted kid that gets this kind of like super, super special doll back, right? And then you hear in the orchestra, for example, here's an effect where the ratchet not is used as a regular ratchet, but just goes in single clicks, so you hear like tick, 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 and it really sounds like bones cracking a little bit, and kind of it's all these kind of so inventive effects in the orchestra. Then you have all these toy instruments, right? Like my favorite is always to look at Abed Chatik, who is our tuba player, and you know, tuba, the really big instrument, and I'm so used to see Chatik with this huge tuba in front of him. But he plays also melodica and swanee whistle, and this is like these tiny toy instruments, and just looking at him over there sitting with this instead of the tuba, these tiny toy instruments is just so hilarious.
Yeah, yeah. And the orchestra, they're playing swanee whistles, melodicas, they're playing kazoos. They have these plastic hose pipes that they wave in the air and to make really, really amazing sound. Vocally, what H.K. Gruber does, this is not a bel canto singer or a reciter. This is just, it's like up and down and special effects, and it's really just astonishing, just the variety, right?
It's a very modern take on chanson, I think, in some way, right? This French way of the chansons. It's also very melodic, the way he sings, but it's very moved into the grotesque, and lots of effects there. The way that he pronounces has a lot of tradition in the. We had these poets in Austria who would form poetry. We read a lot of that in school, actually. A lot of poetry where the sounds of the consonants and the sounds of the vowels would make like a painting of what the poet tries to express. So he brings that kind of like color in there as well.
One of my favorite moments in rehearsal, there's a toy piano in the back, and there's a moment, or actually more than one, but there's a moment where the player needs to, with both hands, just play as loud as he can on the little piano. And in rehearsal, Maestro Gruber, he said, louder. The player whacked the piano. No, louder. Try to destroy it. And then it was loud enough.
It was loud enough, yeah. Yeah, Gruber said that the toy piano only needs to survive 4 performances. So.
Yeah. So this is really, it's challenging the orchestra in a different way from a normal.
It is actually a very challenging piece. It's not an easy piece, because also these toy instruments, I mean, the musicians have to actually, you know, play the right notes also on these instruments, and it's not the regular instruments they often play. But I think it's also a lot of fun, and I mean, for us, I can just like, you know, for me, it's just an incredible honor to have Gruber himself with us, that he flew here and really performs with us. He doesn't do so many performances anymore because he's not, you know, he's not 50 anymore or so, but he was really discovered by Bernstein, and his music was played by all the biggest orchestras in the world, Vienna Philharmonic, Cleveland, Boston at Tanglewood, all, you know, I mean, he is in the UK all the time, and really, his time has become rare because he still very actively composes, and so having him in person doing his own piece with us here is quite special. I think it's a very, very special moment.
And now I believe we have to let you go get ready for a concert. So, Maestro David Danzmayr, thank you so much for spending a little time with all of us.
Thank you, everybody.
And thank you all for being here. Enjoy the concert.
Thanks so much. Thank you.